Okay, railroads were the first big business, so we're going to concentrate on railroads for a while. With railroads, you have a double situation, so to speak. You have a double situation. It's true in general, but this is particularly true in railroads, which is the first large-scale industry. Namely, you have a fantastic progressive increase in standard of living, a fall in transportation costs and all that. And along with it, you have the government stepping in very heavily to subsidization, later regulation, and messing things up. So you have a double effect here. In other words, you have two things happening in a railroad situation. One is a tremendous competitive cheapening of costs, a competitive improvement of standard of living, an increase in competition. On the other hand, tremendous subsidies on the part of the government, plus later on attempts at merger and finally railroad regulation. And we'll see why railroad regulation came in later. As I mentioned before, the Lincoln administration was a heavily railroad-oriented administration, and one of the first things they were committed to was a huge subsidization program to the new transcontinental railroads, which they proposed to build across the West. The subsidization, first of all, in a homesteading system, which I already mentioned, was a libertarian proposal. What you have is the right of way is granted. In other words, if somebody wants to build a railroad across 1,000 miles of nothing, the property it would get in a homesteading law kind of setup would be whatever it uses. In other words, it's right of way to put it. It would then own the right of way. So it means the tracks, the bed on which the track is embedded in stuff, and the station terminals and whatever. So essentially the shoulders, essentially a few feet on each side of the track. That would basically be what the railroad would own in a libertarian free market setup, a homesteading setup. And some railroads are indeed built that way. As a matter of fact, we'll see, one great transcontinental railroad was built in a purely free market thing, and it did not go bankrupt like almost all the others did. And it competed very well with the rest of it. It's called the Great Northern. That comes a little bit later. But at any rate, this is not the way it was done. What the Republicans wanted was a very heavy subsidization and privileging to the railroads. And so instead of just giving them the right of way, they gave the railroads, first of all, they gave them, as we'll see in more detail later as we go along, they gave them a huge amount of loans, basically interest-free loans, heavy subsidies per mile of track, and cash, plus huge amount of land, and 20 miles, every mile, alternate 20-mile sections, 20 square mile sections, which would mean something like 4.5 miles, whatever, about 4.5 miles in each, but an alternate section, so it means you can't do very much in here. In addition to that, the government, this is bad enough, and that's this huge subsidy here. Also, of course, this becomes the most, first of all, they gave the railroads the best land in the West. Second of all, in addition to giving them all this land, the U.S. government closed for settlement all land on each side up to about 60, sometimes 100 miles. Closed off. Nobody was allowed to settle. To 100 miles on either side of the track. So in other words, obviously everybody wants to get to the railroad station because that's there's not much going on the West here except the railroad, and the rest is Indian country or whatever, barren. So this becomes the choicest land. The government closed off for settlement, didn't allow anybody to settle any place except buying land from the railroads. In other words, railroads get this free land from the government and then resell it to the settlers at a high price, essentially a monopoly price, so to speak. Especially because the government kept out of settlement for many years everything on each side for many miles, 80 miles or so on each side of the railroad. Fantastic subsidization. And because of this, an enormous amount of crookery also took place. In addition to this boodle, what was often called the robber barons came in. The robber barons were really, the robbery came about because it was an open channel by the federal government. And we'll see how that was done. The amount of there's differences of whichever place you go to get the data, how many millions of miles of acreage was handed out by the federal government to the railroads. I guess it depends on which, some of it was given back. And some, it was around 220 million acres. Enormous amount. Especially considering, as I say, no, the other land wasn't worth much, and a huge amount, much more than that, was kept out of circulation for many years. Forcing people, if they want to get on this thing, to settle to buy land at a high price from the railroad. As a result of this and other things, we'll see as we go along, the farmers begin to start griping about the railroads. And the thing is, the later gripes are much more irrational. Later gripes are the freight rates were too high, which they obviously weren't, and they were falling all the time. But the basic gripes came about by the 1870s, by the late 1860s and early 1870s, was so-called anti-monopoly movement among the Western farmers. They had very good grievances. They had all this land was being kept out of circulation. Railroad had this free gift of land, and all this land was held out of circulation, and this land was untaxed by the local government. So he had set up a local government. The railroad land was tax exempt, even while being held out of circulation. So naturally, I don't blame the farmers for griping. I'd be griping too. So it wasn't a socialistic or statist type of gripe, the anti-monopoly movement. It was really essentially an attack on the railroad privileges. Basically, there were 4 big transcontinental railroads which got the big bulk of the subsidies and the grants and the loans. If we get it's really 3 if you look at it. One of them was in 2 halves. I'm not exactly a distinguished cartographer, but I'll do my best here. All right, something like that. Anyway, the two big grants at the beginning. The first big grant was the Union Pacific, which started, I believe, in Omaha, Nebraska, and went west, and then the Central Pacific, which started from San Francisco, and went east to join it. Now, this is the UPCP. This is the famous Golden Spike. I think it was 1869, where they met in Utah, and they drove the Golden Spike, symbolized whatever. So this is very heavily subsidized. The Union Pacific, Central Pacific. We'll see. Then there's the Northern Pacific, which begins around, west of Chicago, I think, Iowa, around there, and it goes to Portland. Another very heavily subsidized. This got about 44 million acres plus a lot of money subsidy. 44 million acres. All of these, I think, went bankrupt not too long. The big land grant boom was Union Pacific got its first big grant in 1862. The others a few years later, and the whole thing began to collapse by 1872. So it was actually in the panic of 1873, most of them went bankrupt. So it was about 10 years of fantastic boom. And so the separate. Well, let's see. There's yeah. I should have looked at the map. Somewhere near Chicago. It was somewhere west of Chicago. Yeah. Huh? Well, the use is to give the railroad a fantastic increase in price. In other words, if you'd like to settle somewhere here, you can't do it because it's kept out of use by the government. The government, remember, owns all the land automatically, okay? It means you have to go to the railroad land and buy it for a very high price. This benefits the railroads, an extra privilege to the railroads. The railroads are getting subsidies about 3 ways. They're getting the big land grant, then getting land taken out of circulation. So the settlers have to settle on railroad land, buy the land at a high price in railroads, instead of going here for nothing, really, you see. And so it's part of the monopoly situation. Plus, they got a huge amount of loans per mile of track, financial, outright cash loans or grants or how to. So these are the two big transcontinental ones. And then there was Southern Pacific, which starts in Los Angeles and continues somewhere in Texas. That wasn't, sort of transcontinental, I guess. Okay, so this is Northern Pacific got the most amount of land. It got 44 million acres. And I think the other three got 44 million. Of course, this is about half each, all these three together got about 44 million. So about 88 million just of those, the big four, so to speak. I shouldn't call them the big four. The big four is also named the Central Pacific leadership. At any rate, those big four transcontinental railroads. This is originally Central Pacific. Very soon, Central Pacific merges with Southern Pacific and basically takes it over under the name Southern Pacific. I mean, these guys are running it. This becomes Southern Pacific, the whole California thing, a little bit later. On the Union Pacific, one interesting phenomenon here, which I only found out about a couple of years ago. I was reading more about this. Get this. Well, anyway, Grenville Dodge was the main entrepreneur of Union Pacific, and as soon as the Civil War starts, he gets himself appointed a general in the American Army, the Northern Army, of course, and he takes a whole bunch of troops, federal troops, takes it out of the war. And uses the troops to do what? They knew what the route was going to be, of course. All the insiders knew. Well, by the way, another thing they did is the insiders, the top entrepreneurs and president, vice president, etc., knew what the route would be. They often bought land along the way and then sold it to the railroad at a very high price. All right. Anyway, General Dodge takes a whole bunch of soldiers and uses a huge army and uses it to destroy all the Indians en route. It was just genocidal massacre of the Indians in order to clear the route for his own goddamn railroad, which should be granted to him in 1862. So that was his army function. I think it's an interesting example of the use of the army as what does it mean? It means, you see, one of the things you have to realize about business and government, the use of businessmen. Use of government by businessmen to socialize costs. In other words, to take their costs and impose them, because nobody wants to pay out costs. To take the costs and impose them on the taxpayer, whatever it amounts to. So use the army. What the hell? They take the army, they are conscripts anyway. Use them to kill all the Indians en route. So it's to clear the path for Union Pacific. Then as soon as he clears the path, he gets out of the army and becomes the head of of Union Pacific. Another thing these guys did, I'll give you some examples as we go along. Everybody was on the take. I mean, all the congressmen were on the take. There was a Union Pacific group in Congress, headed, I think it was Union Pacific. Let me make sure it's Northern. Union Pacific group was headed by Congressman Oakes Ames of Massachusetts, and he was the leader of what was known as the Union Pacific faction. And what they did is everybody was on the take. When Grant comes in 1864, 1860, I guess 68. When Grant comes in 68, his entire administration was on the take. His his personal secretary, his vice president, the head of the Senate, the head of the House, the whole gang was on the take. I mean, literally on the take for both Union Pacific and Northern Pacific. Grant himself was not on the take. Grant himself was drunk most of the time and didn't know what was going on. I mean, you could say he was honest, but I don't think he cared one way or the other. Everybody else was on the take, and the whole gang was involved with this thing. And what they would get is this. Not only would they get actual money and cash from the railroads, in three cases, the Central Pacific, Union Pacific, and Northern Pacific, the top managers would form construction companies. Their own construction. In other words, the railroads were a big business. They had a huge amount of stockholders and a huge amount of bondholders. It was a big the only really big corporation. Most of the banks invested about 10% of the stock. The rest of it was private investors. Many of them were English. Also, a lot of small investors because it was on the stock market. There was no stocks, no manufacturing companies were on the stock market yet. They were all private partnerships. They weren't big enough to have corporations. But railroads are big enough now to be incorporated. So you had a huge number of stockholders. The inside managers not only had a lot of stock, but they also they formed their own construction companies. One of them, I think, the Central Pacific. It's called the Credit Mobilier. I'll get to that specifics in a minute. They formed these construction companies, which are formed by the only stockholders of these construction companies were the top stockholders of the railroads. They went into the construction business. They built the railroads and sold the railroads then to the railroads. In other words, the Central Pacific, the Union Pacific Construction Company, constructed the railroad with huge grants of money, subsidies from the government, being per mile of many cases of track. And then they sell it to the railroad. They sell it at a very high price. The estimates are about the price is about double what they would have been charged in the free market. In other words, double the cost, basic price in the free market. So it's essentially these guys fleece their own stockholders and bondholders, essentially robbing with government, based on government subsidies too. Yeah.
The owners of the railroad and the construction company.
Yeah, not all the owners, the top owners, the few insiders.
They sold their railroad.
Yeah.
How were they making money? Wasn't the railroad losing money then?
Yes, exactly. The situation is, let's say you want to form a big corporation, okay? You're a 2% shareholder, you and two other buddies. Then you form another corporation, you're the president. You then hire another corporation headed by yourself and buddy, and your buddies, which have 100% of the share, to sell all the equipment. You sell at a very high price, and essentially you're fleecing your other shareholders. What amounts to is robbery of the other shareholders by the few insiders. It was, of course, illegal then, but there was no prosecution because the government was in on this stuff. So as a result, you have very low profit rates of the railroad and eventual bankruptcies. Much of this, huge amount of profits by the construction companies. They were coining it. Their capital was given to them by the taxpayer in most cases, and then they'd sell it at double the value to their own railroad.